see you. We'll get started here. And before we do, Raymond, how about leading us a word of prayer tonight?
Dear Lord, thank you for this day and all your many blessings. Thank you for the events of this Lord's Day, Father, your day. And I pray that we'll come into this study, Father, with open minds and open hearts. Lord, we're just thankful for all the things that are around us, both above us and below us, and right around us, Father, that point us to you, point us to your salvation plan, point us to your love for the world, and desire to win us back to you, Father. Lord, be with Daddy as he teaches to us today. I just pray that you give him words to say, help us to learn, help us to seek to be better Christians. Father, may this study be a encouragement to us and inform us. Lord, thank you for your Son. Thank you for the man that died for us on the cross, rose again 3 days later. By faith in him, his shed blood and his resurrection, we may be saved. Be with the ones that are sick, be with our church. Father, thank you for all the blessings and mercies you pour out upon us. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. You notice that little slip there where he said preaching and then he turned to teaching. Well, I've preached to him for the last 40-something years. Done a lot of preaching to him. Take a look at this burial shroud, and let me preface it by saying that, you know, as Protestants, we don't look at a lot of icons and we don't look at a lot of relics. If you're in the Catholic Church, in the Eastern Orthodox, and the Russian and the Greek Orthodox Christian churches, they put great emphasis on icons. And you go into one of those churches, and I mean, you can't hardly see the ceiling for the things they got hanging from the ceiling. But as Protestants, that was one of the things that in the Protestant Reformation, people rebelled against, was all these icons and all these images and so forth. So that's how we've always been taught and how we've been raised. So I was always very leery of any artifacts or any icons, especially that was controlled by the Catholic Church, because I just thought it's obvious they overdo it quite a bit. And so many years ago, when I first learned about and started studying about the Shroud of Turin, I just pretty much dismissed it as just being another Catholic icon, artifact. And but then in 1978, they did what's called a stirrup, and we'll look at this later hopefully, the stirrup examination, where they did the first really in-depth scientific analysis of the shroud. And most of those men who did that, I think it was all men, maybe a couple of women, they went into it assuming that it was something from the Middle Ages that somebody had done, and they all went into it saying, you know, we're going to disprove it as being anything important. Most of them were atheists, as a matter of fact. Well, after they did the stirrup investigation, which lasted a total of 122 hours nonstop, they did it in shifts. They did every kind of test they could think of. They could not figure out how the image got on the shroud. They determined that the blood stains on it are human blood. Since that time, it's been typed. It's AB blood. It's been DNA'd as far as determining that it's of human origin, and so forth. So after I read about the stirrup investigation, I got to doing a lot of reading and studying on the shroud. And 40-something years later, I'm absolutely convinced it's the burial shroud of Jesus, and the image on that shroud is Jesus, and we can see his face. And so one of the fascinating things that we'll cover here about it is, after all those hundreds of years, when they first photographed it in 1898, they discovered it was what's on the shroud is a negative. Nobody in years gone by, no artist could ever have known of such a thing. Photography didn't exist. They then discovered that it's three-dimensional. And so it goes on and on and on. So that's what we're going to look at. And I want to preface that by saying, if you're skeptical, I understand that, because I was. But I've done a lot of study on it, just finished another book on it. They've done a lot of recent research, which just is mind-boggling, what they discovered. And I'm convinced that that's exactly what it is, and that God has preserved that for us in these last days for scientific examination and evaluation. And he's saying to all the skeptics you better take a closer look. I've left this for you. So we're going to look at that. We're going to go through it, some of these slides fairly quickly. And first of all, we'll look at the burial clothes, because this is some of the scripture in the Gospels which references the linen shroud. And the linen shroud that Jesus was wrapped in for burial is mentioned 6 times in the Gospels alone. And here's 3 of them here. Joseph of Arimathea, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, Matthew said. Mark said they wrapped him in the linen shroud. Luke said wrapped him in a linen shroud. That kind of emphasis in the scriptures is telling us something. It's saying to us, take a close look here. Take a close look. This is important. Peter, when he went into the sepulchre, it says he stooped down and beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves. And it tells us again in John that they wrapped him in linen clothes with the spices. And this is really important when we get to it later, but where he says, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. So in order to understand what's there, we have to know how the Jews buried their people. And again, John, Peter stooped down, looked in, saw the linen clothesline, but he went not in. Simon Peter, I think I said Peter, didn't I, John? Simon Peter went in and saw the linen clothesline. John then says, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. So in the Gospels, we have this very detailed, especially in John, we have this very detailed description of the events of the death of Jesus and how he was taken down from the cross, how he was buried. It tells us great details about the burial, which was the manner of the Jews, and so forth. So, as I said 6 times. It appears 9 times, as you saw in the account of Jesus' burial. It's a flaxen thread or yarn, and then I won't get into all those are other words, original words from the Greek and so forth that tells us how they were translated in the Gospels. And then we get to the fact that it emphasizes, obviously, over and over again, his resurrection, that he is risen. And they said, the angel said to the people, come and see where the Lord lay. They want them to come look at it. They want them to see that the body's not there. They want them to see that the burial clothes are there. And I believe that what they saw was this image of Jesus clearly on the cloth. And then they were instructed to go tell his disciples he was risen. And so on. And it goes on talking about, over and over again in the Gospels, Jesus' resurrection from the dead. So he's risen indeed, the Bible tells us. The angel told us he is risen indeed. So there's an artist's conception of Peter and John running to the sepulchre after they've been told by the women, by Mary primarily, that the tomb's empty. I don't know who this artist was, but look at that look on the face of Peter especially. He's got to get there as quickly as he could. Now, one of the little interesting bits about that is that Peter was probably a much older man than John. John was probably the youngest, possibly the youngest of the disciples. So one of the evidences of that is that he ran off and left Peter. Peter couldn't keep up with him. And he got there first, stooped down, didn't go in. Peter, being Peter, he just brushed right by him, went on the tomb. And he looked and he beheld these things. So here's a man who, after the photograph, which we'll get to a little later, and the evidence began to come out in many years gone by about the shroud, he did a lot of teaching on the importance of what they saw, Peter and John saw when they looked into the tomb and went into the tomb. And that tells you a little bit about him when he lived and so forth. And he wrote a book entitled The 6 Miracles of Calvary in 1927. That can't be right, can it? He didn't die in 1901 and write a book in 1927. But anyway, he wrote a book there, and it was about in chapter 5, about the undisclosed grave clothes of Christ. And so he gets into that, and he begins to list some of the things we can need to look at. John devoted 5 verses to the grave clothes. He said, obviously spending such a large amount of time on this specific issue emphasizes its extreme importance. When John saw the arrangements of the grave clothes, he instantly believed that Jesus had risen. Now, that's what we've always taught, that what John saw, because the Scriptures tell us he believed, even though they did not yet understand the Scriptures pertaining to the resurrection. One of the things that many theologians believe that also tells us is that John believed at that moment that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. There could be no doubt in his mind, because he knew he was resurrected. Therefore, he knew that he had to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He goes on to say the arrangement of the clothes so clearly expressed a divine intervention that he became instantly convinced of the Lord's resurrection and that he was Messiah. And the specific arrangements of the grave clothes was designed to produce just such an effect and visually portray the resurrection. This is a man writing 100 years ago about that. He said it was a perfect demonstration. John personally knew that Jesus had really died and been buried. But seeing the clothes that had been on Jesus' body reminded him of that. They knew what had happened. They knew the horror of crucifixion and so forth. It was clear that the body was missing from the tomb on the third morning. He could see that with his own eyes, for the empty grave clothes were lying by themselves. So there's been speculation over the years as to exactly what configuration the grave clothes were in. And some would say, well, because he had been tucked into this shroud, it not only was wrapped around him, and I'll show you a little in a minute here what it looked like. It was over 14 feet long, and they would lay the body on one end of it and then fold it over the body, and then they would wrap it and they would tie it snugly around the body. Looked like sort of like a mummy. And so many people believe that they were lying there undisturbed, other than the fact that they were empty, and that they knew it was obvious that nobody could have gotten out of those grave clothes without disassembling them. And so that's one of the things that's believed. But now, in light of all this, it's probably much more than that, because we believe that image was on it, and it was probably much clearer then, 2,000 years ago, than it is today. He said, by looking at the miraculous arrangement of the grave clothes, he could clearly tell that the body had not been removed by human intervention. The sequential progress of events in Christ's resurrection was revealed to the eyes of John in that small tomb the moment his eyes fixed upon the scene. So it was obvious to John that what had happened there was not done by man. It was supernatural. It was God's intervention. And there's an artist's idea of what it might have looked like, the clothesline. Now, one of the important things is, too, the napkin it talks about, which is called a sudarium, was laid to the side. And I'll explain that later, too, but we also have that sudarium. It's known as the Sudarium of Avviato because it's in a church in Avviato, Italy. And by the way, just to whet your appetite a little bit, they've done detailed research and it matches perfectly with the face of the man on the shroud. This is the church of St. John the Baptist, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. And that's where the shroud is kept and has been there since about 1532, something like that. So there's a picture of the shroud in its entirety. It's 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. And it's linen, and it's what's known as it's left me right now the type of weave, I'll think of it in a minute, herringbone weave. And that becomes important in dating and so forth. Because one of the things that convinces me too that this the burial shroud of Jesus is there have been so many attempts down through the centuries to discredit it or destroy it. And I think Satan's behind that clearly. So you can't make it out if you're not familiar with it, but what you have there right here is his face, because he's lying on his back on that section, and this is the back of his head. And you can see his arms right here. The reason you can see them so clearly is they're covered in blood. And there's blood at his feet because he had been crucified. The man who's buried in this shroud was crucified. He was scourged from head to toe. He was speared in the side. He had worn a crown of thorns. And so here's his arms. In fact, here's his legs that you can see somewhat. So it's a real pale image that's on the shroud, which is, we believe, 2,000 years old. Now, these other odd items here you see, that's where it was damaged by fire. It was folded up, and it was almost burned up. It's been almost destroyed by fire twice. And interestingly, the places that have been damaged by the fire never obscure the body image on it. So it's a single piece of linen cloth, as we said. It's a 3/1 herringbone weave, which is consistent with first century weaving of linen. It's bloodstained. His faint front and back images of a man it has on it. A man who's clearly crucified and so on. He appears to have been scourged and crucified. He seems to be resting in the burial repose. Hopefully we'll get to this, and we'll look at it later, but there's been some recent research, detailed research by medical experts and physicists who say that when the image was projected into the shroud, the man was upright, the body was upright. His hair is hanging straight down, for instance. The way the light is on his face when the image appears. That's only been determined very recently. For centuries, it has been identified by Christians, as we said, as the burial shroud of Jesus. Let's a little bit closer look at it. Again, you can see his face, his arms, his legs, his feet. There's blood where the blood's drained out of his feet because he's been crucified. He's had nails driven through his feet. We'll look at it a little closer later, but over here on the side is where he was speared in the side, and blood and serum drained out. You know what John said? That when they speared him in the side, blood and water came forth. John didn't know what serum was 2,000 years ago. But when it was observed, it was obvious to him that it looked like water, which is what serum looks like, which come from the chest cavity of a dead man. So here's another, the one I was talking about. This is when the scientific analysis really got underway. In 1898, when Segundo Pia was allowed to take a photograph of the shroud. He had an old, ancient wooden box camera. That's Segundo Pia there, an Italian man, obviously. Back in his darkroom, he examined the glass plate negative by holding it up to the light. He was so startled by what he saw that he almost dropped the negative, he said. And he said that he cried out, "I'm looking at the face of the Lord." Segundo Pia in 1898. And this is what he saw. What Pia saw was a positive, realistic looking picture of a man. This is the positive. The one that's on the shroud is a negative, a photographic negative. Pia's negative was a positive, as it says the shroud was a negative. Isn't that a remarkable picture of an image on the shroud that's 2,000 years old? Now, there are all kinds of people who will tell you it ain't 2,000 years old, it's a medieval forgery. There's no way. It's impossible. It could not be. And so I believe that that's the face of Jesus. I believe that's him in death, but at the moment that he's resurrected. And that's what put the image on there. They cannot tell you. No scientist on the face of the earth today can tell you how the image got on there. So, what you see here, these white spots are blood stains. And it's consistent with him having worn a crown of thorns. He's got lacerations all in his head. And one of the interesting things about that is that we always see Jesus pictured in art and so forth with just a band of thorns around his head. But the researchers say, no, it would have been a cap that they put down over his head. They may have put the ring too, but they also put a cap, and they believe the reason for that was that the thorns that the Roman soldiers put around his head was a mockery of the Caesars, the emperors, wearing a laurel around their head. You see pictures of that, drawings and artwork. They believe that they then made a cap of thorns and pushed it down over his head because they were calling him the king of the Jews, a crown, and then they were saying he's also a priest. The priests wore that type of hat. And he has all these lacerations in his scalp and in his forehead and so forth, consistent with thorns. Another thing he has here is His right eye is swollen shut where he's been beaten. See that big puffy spot right there? And how his eyes closed. You've seen somebody with a black eye that swells shut. Becky told me recently that's going to happen to me if I didn't act right. That my eye's going to be swelled shut. But anyway, he's been beaten in the face. His nose is broken. Now let me clarify very quickly for you. The scriptures told us in prophecy that no bone of him would be broken. No bone of him has been broken. Whenever you get your nose broke, it's cartilage. I've had my nose broke. And my old nose was twisted and flat, and then over time it sort of like straightened out because it's cartilage. It recovers. So this man has a broken nose, a bruised eye, and his beard has been plucked, which the scriptures tell us about. In the Old Testament it tells us that. Now in 1902, as they began to, after this photograph was discovered, that it was a negative on the shroud and they had the positive and they could see this face, they began to do serious research. And these two men, Delange and Vignon, in 1902, began to do serious scientific study of the shroud. They believed that the photographs were anatomically correct. There's nobody who was a medieval artist, no matter how good they were, that could get the anatomy of a man perfectly. Michelangelo couldn't. Leonardo da Vinci couldn't. They did some beautiful work, but they never were anatomically perfect. Could not be. They conducted experiments which demonstrated that the image could not be paint. Many people say what the blood that's on there, that was painted on there. They determined in 1902 it couldn't be paint because paint cracks when you roll it up and handle it, move it. Vignon showed dye could not have been used as it would spread through along the threads. And the images on the threads on the shroud are so superficial that they're just on top of it. They don't penetrate it at all. Paint or dye or stain or anything would. So they believe the image was caused by some kind of vaporization, and they tried to reproduce it by various means but could not. Both became convinced of the shroud's authenticity, that it's real. And that's Paul Vignon there. The other one was Delange. So one of his main contributions was his identification of the similarities between portraits of Christ from the 6th century onwards in the shroud. Now what that means is, if you go back and look at artwork, particularly Roman artwork, where they portrayed Jesus, he's portrayed as a young, boyish looking fella with short hair, because that's how the Romans wore their hair. That's how you always find it until the 6th century. And suddenly in the 6th century, art changed. And they began to portray Jesus with a beard, with long hair, and some of them would even put that little squiggle on his forehead. Now, why that's important, we'll get to later, is that in 1988, they did carbon-14 dating of the shroud and said that it could only go back to about 1300. But all the other evidence refutes that, and they have since debunked the carbon-14 dating because they took it from the wrong part of the shroud. It had been repaired in some places because of damage in the fire, and they got the wrong cloth from the Middle Ages. So that's why that's so important, because you go all the way back to the 6th century, from the 13th to the 6th century, and all of a sudden they changed their artwork. Why? Because the shroud was rediscovered. It had been hidden away, and we'll get to that. The shroud was rediscovered in Edessa, in the 6th century, and that's when art changed. It's the way Jesus is depicted. So, right-thinking people a lot smarter than I am, say that it's obvious that they saw the shroud in the 6th century. And he noted that there were 15 features on the face of the image that were used for comparison to various icons which became known as the Vignon markings. And by the way, for identification, facial identification, you don't need 15. Fingerprints, you don't need 15. When you get 15, that's conclusive. So they did some more photography in 1931, and this is the man who was called on to do it, Giuseppe Henri, and he was allowed to photograph the shroud with much more sophisticated photography equipment 33 years after Segundo Pia had photographed it. And this is his image. Took that photograph in May of 1931, as you see. And again, the man in the shroud, the image of the shroud is a negative and his photograph's a positive. By the way, those white lines across it are simply folds in the cloth that leaves that line. And then in 1950, this man, Dr. Pierre Barbet, came along. He was a renowned French physician, World War I battlefield surgeon. Can you imagine that job? And chief surgeon at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paris. He began to study Henri's photographs. And in 1950, he wrote a book, A Doctor at Calvary. So this was one of the first times that a highly skilled physician who had had a lot of experience with wounds and treating wounds and so forth on the battlefields of World War I took a careful look at the man in the shroud, the image. And so here is a better depiction of it, digitally contrasted, and so you can see it a little better. By the way, a little later on we'll see it, but all of this, oops, let me back up here, I got the wrong one. Right, all of this, these markings here and here are from the scourging. Some people who studied the shroud say that there are over 200. You know, under the Mosaic law, a person could not be scourged more than 39 stripes because 40 was the limit, and it stopped one short just in case they miscounted, because after 40 stripes, you may die. It may kill you. They believe that this body of this man had more than 200. And they can determine what was used by the patterns and so forth, and they can also determine that there were two men scourging him, one on each side of him. So, Barbet was a pioneer in the field of crucifixion and shroud research. He believed it to be authentic, anatomically correct, and consistent with crucifixion. He provided a forensic pathologist analysis of what he saw in the shroud. He proved that a nail in the palm could not support a human body. It had to be in the wrist. Now, in all the old artwork we see, Jesus has always got a nail driven through his palm. You know, if you take a 16, 20 penny nail, drive it through your palm, it would hurt, but it won't do much damage. And it certainly will not hold up the body of a man. And so Barbet did research with cadavers. And he would take a cadaver, somebody who had just died, and he would nail it to a cross through the palms, and it'd pull out, and it'd collapse on the floor. Now, another thing that proves that they drove the nail through the carpal tunnel of the wrist was because when we look closer at the image of the man in the shroud, his hands are crossed, and you can't see his thumbs. You can only see his fingers. Nobody in the Middle Ages understood that nerve, if you damage that nerve, it's going to cause your thumb to retract to this position. And the man in the shroud's thumb is hidden in the palm of his hand. And he did a lot of research on that back before 1950. He saw the shroud the last time it was shown outside to the public on October the 15th of 1933. He was able to get close to the shroud, the original, and see it. And in his expertise, he knew the second he saw it that the red stains on it were blood. And he fell to his knees and said, I am beholding the blood of Christ who died for me. And he wept. That's how profoundly impacted he was when he saw it. He recognized that it contained dried blood, not scientifically established until the 70s. But because of his vast experience, as he looked closely at it, he knew that he was looking at human blood on the shroud. The color, he said, was that of dried blood having impregnated the cloth. Looks like a proud Frenchman there, don't it? So here's the cover of his book, A Doctor at Calvary. And he said, for me, this is a quote from him. He said, as for me, a Catholic and a surgeon, my soul was overwhelmed by this sudden revelation and enthralled by this real presence, which was inescapably self-evident to me. I went down on my knees and adored in silence. That's how it affected him when he's able to look at it closely. And then, and we'll conclude with this guy right here for the night, Dr. Robert Bunklin. He was a forensic pathologist. He was an expert. He had done more than 25,000 autopsies. He performed a forensic examination using life-size photographs of the shroud. And he wrote an article on it called The Legal and Medical Aspects of the Trial and Death of Christ. He absolutely said, there's no question it's Jesus Christ I'm looking at. And we'll go through this and I'll stop. There's about 25, but we'll go through it quickly. He concluded that the body was about 5'11". The man was about 5'11". He weighed approximately 175 pounds. So Jesus, if this is indeed Jesus, and I believe it is, he was no weakling. He was quite a man, especially for his time, physically. Was anatomically well developed and normal. Had long hair and a short beard. He was stiffened in rigor mortis, meaning that death had occurred 24 to 40 hours before the image was formed. Now you remember Jesus died just before sundown on Friday and was resurrected before sunup on Sunday, so that time fits in there perfectly. There were multiple puncture wounds over the entire skull area. There was an abrasion at the tip of the nose. The right cheek was distinctly swollen. There were rounded foreign objects over both eyes. They believe that they were what the Coins call putas. And they think they've identified one of them, which was issued by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. I have one of those, by the way. There was a large blood stain over the right chest area consistent with a post-mortem wound to the chest. There's a penetrating skin wound in the right chest wall produced by a sharp puncturing instrument, the Roman spear. Blood flowing from injuries in the wrist indicate that the victim died with his hands raised about 65 degrees from the horizontal, hanging on a cross. He was nailed through both wrists. Only 4 fingers of each hand are visible, suggesting injury to the median nerve of both wrists, like I said. He was nailed through both feet. The left foot had been flexed over the right foot before nailing. There are a series of traumatic injuries which extend from the shoulder areas to the lower portion of the back and down to the backs of the calves. These images are dumbbell-shaped imprints applied possibly by a whip. The Romans, in their flagellums, would put pieces of bone or barbell-shaped pieces of metal on the end of them so they would bruise and dig into the flesh. So when they would hit them, they would strike them very harshly with that thing. It would sink into the flesh and it'd rip it out. So in all probability, if he had 200 scourge wounds, that probably some of his bones, his ribs or something, were probably exposed. There's abrasion and denuding of the skin over the right and left shoulder blade area consistent with a heavy object like a beam resting on the shoulders. He carried his cross to Calvary. Scourged with hands above head by 2 persons, and whip injuries occurred before other injuries. That's important. Why? Because the scriptures give us the chronological events. And the first thing they did to him, besides slap him around, beat him in the face, spit on him, and so on, hit him over the head with a rod, and put the crown of thorns on him, was to scourge him. Well, they did that before they put the crown of thorns on him. He was executed in an upright position with arms extended upwards. A crucifixion-type posture would be the most plausible explanation for these findings. The wound in the right side released a watery-type fluid from the body cavity as well as blood from the heart area. John said, when they speared him, he saw blood and water. Death occurred due to postural asphyxia as a result of his position during the crucifixion. We always call that, not postural, but if I can think of the term here, compression asphyxia, where if you get something pressed on your chest that's heavy enough, you can't inhale and you suffocate, you asphyxiate. Saw that happen a couple of times, or where it had happened. And by hanging there, they would have to, in order to get a breath, they'd have to push themselves up on their crucified feet, their nailed feet. And after a while, they would become so weak they couldn't do it anymore. And as they hung there, they would die that postural or compression asphyxiation. So his conclusions, in the case of the man on the shroud, the forensic pathologist will have information relative to the circumstances of death by crucifixion, which he can support by his anatomical findings. And one last thing he said, here's his book, is this image of Jesus Christ. He says, from this data, it is not an unreasonable conclusion for the forensic pathologist to determine that only one person in history has undergone this sequence of events. That person is Jesus Christ. Any questions or thoughts on that? Is that not profound? Is that not profound? Can't be. Can't be anybody else on that shroud but Jesus. Nobody else ever. Who else was ever crucified with a crown of thorns on his head? Nobody in history that we're told about, and we're told about it in detail in the Scriptures. And that's just the beginning, by the way. What you've heard tonight is just the beginning. It gets much, much better. Mind-boggling. Wonderful. That's why I'm so convinced. Any question or comment? All right. Thank y'all for coming tonight. Good Lord willing, we'll continue with this next Sunday night. Let's see what we're going to look at next. The 3D image, which was discovered in 1976. Impossible, by the way. That's impossible. Don't matter how advanced photography is today, you cannot take a photograph that's three-dimensional. It's two-dimensional. It always has been, always will be. This one, from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, is three-dimensional. And we'll hopefully get to that. Thank y'all for coming. Let me see who. Let's see. Amy, would you dismiss us?
Dear most gracious Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you again for this time together, Father, as we learn more about you, Father. We thank you for the things that you reveal to us as believers to strengthen our faith, but also the things that you give to those who have not made a decision to follow you, Father. Faith and knowledge of you. Lord, just please be with everybody who's here. Keep them safe as they go into their week. And we carry your message to those that we meet this week.
Amen. Thank y'all.